Well, hello then. Welcome back to the Data Governance and AI podcast from inside Kubrick's training lab. I am Molly Slan, and I am one of the associate principals within our data management space. And I'm joined with Simon Duncan, who is...
After you, Molly.
Our head of data management. In the last episode, we focused on the need for basic governance with AI and machine learning. That's artificial intelligence and machine learning. So now we're going to flip it a little bit and think about how data governance can be enhanced by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and explore a bit more about the changing landscape of data governance. So I'll hand over to you, Simon, because I think we're going to flip it around a bit and have a bit more of me talking on this one, right? So I'll let you take it away.
But what I'd like to do first, and I think this is important because, as Molly said, we're slightly shifting the emphasis here, but still very much around the data governance. So I think starting now, just in case you didn't have the opportunity to hear our first podcast, a definition of data governance. And I mean, any of you who have been on the DM course know full well that I repeat this and emphasize the benefit of definitions. So the definition here, and this is from Dharma International, the exercise of authority, control, and shared decision-making, planning, monitoring, and enforcement over the management of data assets. In data management, the process of setting, controlling, administering, and monitoring conformance with policy. Now, I didn't want to sound too pedantic there. I probably did. One of the things that's important is if you look at that definition, the process of setting, controlling, administering, and monitoring conformance with policy. Now, I've always described that to the DM consultants as referencing action terms, things that need to be done. And the traditional way within data governance was to use people to do that. But part of the emphasis, as Molly will be going through and I'll be asking some questions, is just to think, well, those action terms that in the past have involved invariably an understaffed data office, whether they can actually be taken over successfully by A&I, artificial intelligence, and the potential risks that could create. So that's the emphasis for this podcast. I think the first thing, just from that definition, how is data governance changing?
It's a really interesting question. I think quite a pertinent one for at the moment with so many changes in the data landscape as well at the moment. There's data governance in its classical sense, like you said, was that writing those policies, writing the standards to kind of direct the way that people worked, and if you could, implementing technical controls, whether that's things like access controls or training and awareness. But like you said, it's all people driven. It's quite resource heavy. It relies on either a strong or large data governance team or people with capacity to be able to implement those, and leveraging your data owners and your data stewards and your data custodians to champion data governance throughout an organisation. Classical data governance isn't necessarily going anywhere. It's just shifting and developing. I think there's another shift that's happening if we take it down a slightly different route, in that a lot of data governance, I think, was rooted in regulatory compliance initially. And we've had lots of regulations come in. You spoke about it when you first started, Solvency II, GDPR, in 2018, but there's not that many new regulations coming in left, right and centre at the moment, apart from things like the changing ones on artificial intelligence, which obviously will impact data governance and the way that gets implemented in an organisation. But we're shifting from having data governance be so focused on compliance with regulation to being, okay, so how can data governance help to drive value? And I think, data governance professionals, yourself and me, would always want it to be seen as something that drives value, but a lot of people don't see it like that, right?
So, I mean, if I may just ask, because that's an interesting point, because it's just like when we talk about data management, data quality management, et cetera, there's those different types. We've always separated data governance from corporate governance, for example.
Yes.
And I think it's always been delineated, as you say, because those regulations in effect demanded it. But I think with ESG and such things, and this is sort of slightly distracting here, from what you're saying, it would suggest that data governance and corporate governance could potentially blend quite effectively.
I think so. I think there should be a shift from data governance only being focused on that kind of regulatory compliance and being, it should always be aligned with a data strategy. It should always be aligned with making sure that we're implementing the strategic goals within your data office. But there's nothing to say that governance and data governance can't support your overarching strategy within an organisation. Absolutely. And if we can leverage data in a better way because we've got better controls, we've got more augmented and automated controls, then we can kind of help to drive that value, which will support corporate governance and making sure that our business goals and requirements are met and that we are controlling in a not restrictive way behaviours not just related to data. But as organisations are becoming more data driven, data will become a part of kind of everything already.
And I think this has always been one of the challenges because people use that horrible term, monetization. I mean, just look at it as commercial focus. But again, from what you're saying, those soft values could potentially become more prominent. And I think that's the challenge for us, looking at this idea of unpeopled. If we're talking about soft values, which are constituted by us, humans, can that be replicated in a machine? Because we can talk about compliance, those hard values, those enforced values, and this is where we're overlapping with ethics, which is where we come into
Absolutely.
A&I. So, I mean, what would those soft values and looking at the potential, I mean, how do you feel about unpeopled, I mean, just personally, unpeopled governance?
From working in governance, it scares me a little bit, the idea of just being able to let technology control everything that you would do and monitor everything that you would do from a data governance standpoint. And I think, at least in the current landscape, there will still have to be an element of people involved, and especially as we're still training artificial intelligence and machine learning models to be ethical. There's a lot of ethical concerns with a lot of them as to whether they are making decisions based on the right ethical principles. Are they treating humans as humans? And are we, when we're implementing technical data governance controls, things like policy as code, is it taking into consideration properly people's behaviours and their other concerns as to how this goes about? And I think there's things like using an artificial intelligence model to dock your pay when you walked into an office. For example, if you were 5 minutes late, prorated, it might dock your pay. This is obviously completely theoretical. And there's a lot of data that goes into that and a lot of ways of handling that. We almost always got to the point of that kind of model, leveraging data in that way to make those decisions would work, as long as somebody is there helping to make those decisions at some point. Because I don't think anybody at this point has enough trust in those kind of technical models to believe that without some human intervention, those soft controls can be properly embedded.
And I think that's what we were talking about in the last podcast about like data quality dimensions, for example. When we were saying, yes, there's the potential, possibly learning new things from these self-learning algorithms. But I think this is the challenge as well. Self-learning algorithms would almost be a contradiction in terms of policy as code, because you want to set up the Boolean statements, the conditional statements for the policy.
Exactly.
And you don't want a self-learning component.
No.
This is it, full stop. So that in itself would require checking by people as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's lots of bits of it that will always need that kind of human input. From the start of it, you could leverage things like automated classification models that do self-learn based on the documents or the data that you've got. And that's fine, but there still needs to be somebody actually going in and saying, yes, this is what you think it is. Yes, this is a CV. No, actually, this is a tax document, something like that. And then you can leverage those kind of self-trained models to implement those softer controls, making sure that there are certain access restrictions to CVs, or only the HR department can see them, using policy as code.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot to think about with implementing augmented data governance, which is the way that we're shifting.
And I think augmented as opposed to unpeopled is probably more helpful, because unpeopled can resonate more scary.
It does, yeah, it does sound a bit, if you say you're taking the complete people element out of it, it's intimidating.
Yeah. Whereas talking about augmented, which is a lot of the work that we've been doing with the new content that we've been put together, is very important. It's a very integral element. So we're talking about, concerns about unpeopled governance. Can we apply the same aspects of collaboration with the machine that we have with people. I mean, this is a more subtle difference, because when we talk about data, sorry, I'm going on, but when we talk about data quality, we talk about providing the users with the confidence in that data quality. Can there be the same confidence in collaboration with AI, self-learning algorithms, machine learning, large language models, etc.? Can there be, unless you're, and we have some very good specialists at Kubrick, but unless you are a specialist in this field, can you genuinely collaborate with this technology?
I think so, and I think that's where you need to, organisations in general need to be really focusing on things like improving their data literacy, and that so that there's a baseline level of data understanding within an organisation. It's not good enough now that there are people that don't know anything about Excel, for example, or anything about how to handle data, because it is part of basically everybody's job. So I think you start with ensuring that there's that data literacy baseline within the organisation. Every data consumer knows, this is what data I handle, this is the controls I need to be putting in place, this is the behaviours I need to be following. And then I think that first level facilitates a bit more of that collaboration. We then have, I think, if you do have the expertise to be able to leverage the technologies and augmented technologies, I think it can actually possibly drive a little bit more collaboration between certain teams. If you're breaking the barriers down, so for example, if you have a set of data engineers that are able to implement data governance and data management controls within a data pipeline, they can build in, because they have the knowledge as to what controls need to be in place. They need to know that there are data owners that approve access. They need to know that there is role-based access control. They need to know that there are policies to prevent the sharing of data implemented, and they need to be classifying the data. If they can understand that enough to implement without having to run to a data governance team, for all of the advice, it creates that autonomy, because you can then free up the data governance team to be able to really focus on monitoring and furthering and driving value, while the engineering teams can implement the baseline. And then actually everybody's got a similar understanding of what that baseline is. You can communicate properly. The data governance team are only then brought in necessarily when it's a concern, or the data engineering team are like, this is beyond my reach, for example. So I think there is the ability to facilitate communication and collaboration with these new technologies. It might be a challenge, because if you do allow those teams to have that extra knowledge, and so they can leverage technologies to implement different topics, when you bring in those cross-functional teams, it's then a case of, okay, well, why do we need to work together? Because I've got the skills to do this anyway. I don't need to talk to the data governance team. But I think that's where there still needs to be, and it's a key part of all data governance models, is an ownership model and a stewardship model, which says not only what the data owners are and the data stewards and the data custodians, but across the whole organisation, who does what and what their responsibilities are. And
this is, sorry to interrupt, but this is exactly where we blend with corporate governance.
Yes.
Because this extends it and I think, I know you, Molly, not wishing to project, but we are both keen silo busters.
Yes.
And the potential here, blending this data, corporate governance, being inclusive, because technology can be very exclusive. And this is something that's, going to be very challenging. That, how do we ensure this is inclusive? And that's where the corporate governance, data, we will focus on providing the best service possible, the best delivery, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we do with DMDG, and make sure it's compliant, et cetera. But to ensure that the processes themselves don't incite fear, are inclusive, that's where, as you say, this data literacy takes on a whole different emphasis. But with the intention, and this is where corporate governance is so relevant, that inclusive component as well is going to be really important.
Definitely. Absolutely.
So I think and this is why I wanted to talk about this inciting fear. I know, sort of a bit emotional, but how do we overcome those barriers. I mean, we can talk about governance, we can talk about in general terms, and you've talked about data literacy, etc. But do you think just looking at an operational team that's not particularly data literate, but they're really good at what they do, they're doing everything that's asked of them, and so how do you encourage that inclusiveness? And this is always a challenge as data governance specialists, because they're doing exactly what they should do.
Yeah.
No one's complaining about what they're doing. But how do you make these new technologies inclusive? So when you say, we don't want them breaking the looms, we're bringing these technologies, these AI, these enhancements, these augmented elements into the process, but it doesn't mean you're going to lose your job. I mean, how do you have that conversation?
It's a big question, and it's a really big challenge, I think, in any data governance journey, whether it is kind of more on the augmented side of things anyway. A lot of data governance focuses on improving processes and making them more efficient, and that does sometimes raise concerns as to, well, actually, if you're going to cut down this process from what would take me 5 hours to an hour, are they going to need all of the right people there?
Yeah.
I think there's a few elements in that everything, at least from a governance perspective, needs somebody at the top of an organisation to buy into it and drive the need for leveraging those technologies and the need for data and the need for evolution.
Yes.
Within an organisation. And if you can get that sponsorship from somebody who is influential and comfortable with communicating about that, you're starting off strong. You can go in and say, look, this person really wants us to evolve and grow. And I think that's another way of putting it. It's not going to be removing their jobs. It's actually making something that was probably a bit more tedious, more efficient, which enables them space to grow and develop themselves and expand into different areas within their space and their role. It's also where I think the element of communication and being innovative in the way that you provide training and awareness with teams comes in. So whether that's a case of providing simple workshops with the teams about this is what the new process is going to be, making sure that there's a forum for them to raise their concerns and talk to them about how this is going to change and how they need to adapt what they're doing. And then if they do raise concerns about this is going to make my job really simple now, what else can we do? Make sure that there's almost a contingency plan in place for that previously. You don't want to go in and scare them, essentially.
And this is again that wonderful word or two words, silo busting. We all need to work together. We all need to ensure that inclusiveness. And I think the additional dimension here, because we're talking about emotion, concern, fear, etc., is to also introduce and have the benefit of HR professionalism coming into these processes as well. So I think that's very good. And again, further encouraging this silo busting. So I think we're obviously seeing, when we look at governance, we're seeing this break. We're not seeing a reactionary element. We're seeing the potential benefits of an evolutionary element that will take us into the next the next stage of governance. AI is just a technology, like, again, going back to the 1860s, batch files automated a lot of processes on delivering data to an operational team desk, for example.
And to add to that, just to jump in, that didn't mean that there's less jobs.
No,
in
not
data,
at all.
So.
Not at all. And this is why, as I say, it's very important, because we're seeing these new technologies potentially enhancing productivity, etc. We want to make sure that our consultants have that training, have that focus, have that understanding, so that as a generation going into the workforce, just like you and for example, coming into the workforce, that you have that level of knowledge, but also comfort.
Yes.
An understanding. And that means that when you're communicating it, you're communicating that level of confidence because you understand it. And that makes the message so much more effective. Over in New York, we've got our analytics governance engineers. They're working, and we've got the data product analytics as well. But I think one thing, just looking in detail and how we've brought it into the new shape cohort now, governance as code. It's a fascinating development. So infrastructure as code was well established, but governance as code now. Maybe just give us, if you could, just a bit of detail on how that has been brought in to this analytics governance engineering branch.
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple of aspects of it. We've got the introduction still of conceptual governance and them understanding ownership, how to write a policy, even just writing it on a document. They still need to understand the basics of governance. Writing a policy, they still need to understand some basic data management principles, master data management, reference data management. But there's then also the element of, okay, so how do we then take those policies and make them technologically implementable? So
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
it is. And, you know, you mentioned it earlier, we will spend some time going through policies, writing what they are, and then going, okay, can these be implemented in binary? Yep. Is there a true or false here? Is there a yes or no? And if not, can we make a decision tree to get there?
Yeah.
And if we can't do any of that, is there any way we can implement some technical controls? And it's all about shifting the mindset from going, we've still got these governance controls, we still need them, to let's see whether there's a way to build code that can do this task. And that is done through things like policy monitoring, using augmentation. I've already mentioned augmented data classification. We'll make sure that they're all familiar with how that works, the new set of consultants. And then we bring in even more technical implementation using policy as code directly, which takes the concepts of those binary true or false and actually implements them. And then governance frameworks that are shifting towards AI and machine learning, things like data mesh and data fabric.
Yep.
And then pipeline automation, making sure that all of those bits are understood, inception of pipeline, from bringing data in to then pushing it out to reports and report monitoring. The aim is that they'll have this deep understanding of how to build a pipeline with this deep understanding of, well, as deep as we can get in the 17 weeks that they have training, the new cohort, on governance and the technical controls there.
And I think just to add to that, because one thing that we've emphasized is this shift within the data model that, you know, and we mentioned it again, just bringing back to our previous podcast, that for me, when I was training you 5-6 years ago, this idea of working at the logical level, looking up to the conceptual, was my point of focus, because that physical was possibly a stretch too far in those days. What we're seeing now in this generational shift within governance and the use of AI is that we're operating much more at the physical layer. So, I mean, possibly just to describe how our tech partners, you know, the tech that's being introduced, which is unusual for a DM course, you know, it's not usually, so maybe just describe how we've shifted the integral component. So it's not just a pipeline build, but it's that design, data repository to, in this instance, we're using Calibra, aren't we?
Yes.
But it's maybe just describe a little bit more around the technologies that they're using now as well.
Absolutely. So I think Calibra's a good shout out there for the basic governance components, at least things like making sure that there's a catalogue in place, and that people understand what data is where. That's a really important part. And data engineers should be leveraging catalogues as much as possible. We have to, I think, steer away from thinking that data engineers themselves are catalogues and steer to using a tool to do that.
Thank goodness.
So that's the first part of it. And then we've got the pipeline itself leveraging things like DBT and Snowflake and Airflow to make sure that there's controls in place. And Snowflake and DBT both have really good governance components built in, and they've got lots of documentation on how you can build that in to their tools and make sure that governance is at heart of the way that we're leveraging those tools. They'll obviously use the kind of languages that we use within data management anyway, things like Python and SQL, but Python is probably one of the easier ones as a programming language. Policy as code leverages programming languages, and what we want to do at the moment is try to make that almost as tool agnostic as possible, so that our consultants are flexible when they go onto client site, that they're not just relying on one specific tool.
And if I may, just to finish, and that flexibility is really important, because even though there's Snowflake, as you say, there's DBT, etc., they're also doing Databricks as well.
Absolutely.
Because it provides that flexibility for our client needs. And I think that's That's just, as I say, a final point to mention on this, that it's also introducing, because talking about governance in AI, etc., it's that need for confidence, but that generational shift that's going to require this flexibility. And we have to make sure we integrate that into our blended practices now.
Definitely. Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those technical sides of data governance implementation, policy as code, mesh, fabric in the second half of this podcast, where we'll be bringing Holly, who is another one of the APs within our team, into it. But I think that's it from me, Simon.
Yep. Well, thank you.
Very much.
Very much enjoyed the questions, and hopefully our audience are a little bit better informed.
Fingers crossed.
And more confident, possibly. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
When we talk about data quality, we talk about providing the users with the confidence in that data quality. Can there be the same confidence in collaboration with AI, self-learning algorithms, machine learning, large language models, etc.? But unless you are a specialist in this field, and we have some very good specialists at Kubrick, can you genuinely collaborate with this technology?
Organisations in general need to be really focusing on things like improving their data literacy, and so that there's a baseline level of data understanding within an organisation. It's not good enough now that there are people that don't know anything about Excel, for example, or anything about how to handle data, because it is part of basically everybody's job.
When we talk about data quality, we talk about providing the users with the confidence in that data quality. Can there be the same confidence in collaboration with AI, self-learning algorithms, machine learning, large language models, etc.? But unless you are a specialist in this field, and we have some very good specialists at Kubrick, can you genuinely collaborate with this technology?
Organisations in general need to be really focusing on things like improving their data literacy, and so that there's a baseline level of data understanding within an organisation. It's not good enough now that there are people that don't know anything about Excel, for example, or anything about how to handle data, because it is part of basically everybody's job.